disrepair. The east had been invaded by the Sassanids, the Danube had been invaded by the Goths, Italy had been invaded by the Alemanni, and the west had been invaded by the Franks. Unable to handle all of these foreign threats at once, and still reeling from the capture of his father, Gallienus watched helplessly as the legions across the empire elevated their own local commanders to the purple, breaking the empire into pieces. The son of Valerian would never again rule a united empire, though he would spend the rest of his life vainly pursuing the dream of reunification. Though we know that the East eventually fell into the hands of Odenathus and his wife Zenobia, when all the trouble began in 260, it actually looked like ex-treasury official Macrianus would be the man calling the shots in Antioch. You'll recall from last time that Macrianus and the general Ballista had organized a resistance to the Sassanid invasion following Valerian's capture, and when the Persians were finally pushed out, the eastern legions naturally looked to the man with the money to continue leading them. Ballista seems to have been content to support Macrianus rather than compete with him, and so Macrianus became the dominant Roman official east of the Hellespont. But for some reason, possibly because he was a cripple, though I'm not entirely sure that that's accurate, Macrianus did not himself assume the imperial dignities. Instead, he induced the legions to elevate to the purple his two grown sons, Quietus and Macrianus the Younger. The two men were dutifully hailed as Augustus, following in the footsteps of the Rhine legions and the Danube legions, who had elevated Postumus and Regalianus respectively. But unlike these other two competing Augusti, the Macriani family had no intention of staying put in the east and simply keeping an eye on the Sassanids. Macrianus did not want to just defend Syria. He wanted to formally oust Gallienus and capture the whole empire for himself. In pursuit of this goal, he and his son Macrianus the Younger packed up 30,000 troops and marched them west to confront Gallienus. Now those numbers are likely exaggerated, but still, after the catastrophic losses suffered at Edessa, the removal of any soldiers at all had to have dangerously weakened the frontier defenses. I would like to say that the fact that the Macriani are about to get stomped into the ground by Gallienus is somehow divine retribution for leaving the east so undermanned. But Regalianus did right by the Danube, defending the empire rather than trying to capture it, and he died too. So, unfortunately, it seems that blind fate rather than karmic justice was doing the yeoman's work throughout the 260s AD. Macrianus had left his son Quietus in charge at Antioch while he and Macrianus the Younger marched on Italy in 261. They only made it as far as the Balkans, though, where they were met and defeated in battle by an army led by Gallienus' top general, Aureolus. Both Macriani were killed in the battle, but, perhaps more importantly, the battle cost the lives of way more troops than the empire could afford to lose. Things in the east probably would have spiraled out of control had not Odenathus and Palmyra picked up the slack Macrianus had left behind. Leading a motley army composed of various eastern auxiliaries, his own Palmyrene heavy cavalry, and probably what was left of Valerian's legionary forces, Odenathus patrolled the border with vigor and kept Sharper's imagination from drifting back to visions of conquest. Of critical importance to his own future career, Odenathus did not throw his lot in with the Macriani, and chose instead to remain loyal to the government of Rome. That did not mean that he went out of his way to defend the honor of Gallienus when the Syrian legions declared Macrianus the Younger and Quietus their new Augusti. But it did mean that when word came back that Gallienus had successfully fended off their challenge, that Odenathus took the opportunity to display his fidelity to the true emperor. The army he led far outshone anything left in the hands of Quietus and Ballista, and after camping his imposing forces outside Antioch, Odenathus ordered that Quietus be captured and executed. No one knows what happened to Ballista, as he simply disappears from the historical record without a trace around this same time, but the presumption is that he too was killed by either Odenathus or some other officer loyal to Rome. The rise and fall of the Macriani left the East, by default, in the hands of Odenathus. He held Roman citizenship and had obviously been a loyal ally, but he was seen by practically everyone as an outsider. After all, he did hail from a city beyond the frontier. But for the moment at least, the citizens of the East had very little time to indulge in prejudices. Odenathus was there, leading an army in defense of the empire. Who cared where he came from? Gallienus himself certainly did not seem to care much about Odenathus' origins, or, at this point, what his ultimate intentions may be, which is to reinforce the East, let alone reassert his full control over it. Gallienus was, for the time being, willing to cede Odenathus dominion over the East, as long as the Palmyrene prince remained loyal to Gallienus and focused his attention on the Sassanids, rather than on accruing more territory for himself within the empire. These terms were amenable to Odenathus, and from 262 until his death in 267 or 268, the Palmyrene prince was the de facto ruler of the Eastern Empire. He was given the title Imperator, in the old military sense of the term rather than the more recent political meaning. But, as was the long-standing custom, the victories of the Palmyrene were technically credited to Gallienus, a subtle piece of propaganda which helped maintain the appearance of subordination on the part of Odenathus. Perhaps betraying his long-term goals, though, shortly after rising to power, Odenathus began styling himself as the King of Kings, just as would a traditional Eastern monarch. In most ways, the rise of Odenathus had very little effect on how the East functioned. It appears that the legionary garrisons were kept mostly intact, and that their commanders were for the most part left in place. The various municipal governments kept running just as they always had, and the lives of the citizens changed not at all. This is all to say that Odenathus ruled with a very light hand. There were no dramatic purges and no mass firings. The only time he really exercised his power was when he acted as the arbitrator of last resort, settling legal disputes or making the final decision on some infrastructure project. Other than that, he did indeed keep his attention focused squarely on the task of defending the provinces from attack. Indeed, the one major difference between life before Odenathus and life after Odenathus was the existence of this huge independent army roving around the deserts, weaving in and out of Sassanid territory, attacking when necessary and defending when necessary. This army was both the reason why Syria was not captured by Shapur and the reason why Gallienus stayed on the west side of the Hellespont. It was an efficient, disciplined, and highly mobile force. Over the course of the 260s, Odenathus did not just keep the Sassanids at bay, but he also pushed east and reasserted Roman dominion over territory that Shapur had annexed during the course of the past decade. There is a reason Odenathus receives near universal praise in the ancient histories, and it's because he seemed to be some quasi-divine savior sent by the gods to rescue the Eastern Empire at its darkest hour. With the Eastern question more or less settled, and the middle provinces back under his control following the death of Regalianus, the West now loomed as the last big finger pointing Gallienus and Rome in the eye. Where Odenathus had diplomatically parlayed his position into one that bore the imperial seal of approval, Postumus ruled in direct competition to Gallienus. Where the eastern provinces still recognized the overall legitimacy of the Roman emperor, and critically, the mints in Antioch still coined in Gallienus' name, the West had gone over to Postumus completely. The Gallic mints coined for Postumus, and celebrated his role as the protector of the West. This was an affront that Gallienus could not tolerate. There is, as with so much else to do with this period, some controversy over the date or dates of Gallienus' attempt to reconquer the western provinces. Some claim that there were two attempts, one in 261 in the immediate aftermath of Postumus' revolt, and another, more concerted effort in 266. Others claim that there was just one attempt, and that it occurred sometime between 263 and 265. Despite the confusion of the dating, though, the outcome remains the same. Gallienus was able to establish a permanent beachhead on the far side of the Alps, but he was unable to decisively defeat Postumus and reunite the empire. As usual, the man leading the attack for Gallienus was Aureolus, the captain of the cavalry. Starting from their headquarters in Milan, the imperial army marched up through the Alps and crossed over into Gaul on their way to the capital of Gallia Belgica, which also served as the capital of Postumus's Gallic Empire. Postumus had been made aware of the invasion by spies in Gallienus's camp, and was ready when the army led by Aureolus finally appeared. In the battles that followed, though, there is one clear fact that the ancient sources point out again and again. Postumus was beaten by Aureolus, but that, for whatever reason, Aureolus did not press his advantage, capture his enemy, or crush his enemy's army. Though there could have been any number of good reasons for his failure to deal a killing stroke, like that maybe his victories were not as complete as we have been led to believe, the consensus among the Romans was that Aureolus had made a secret pact with Postumus. In this telling, Aureolus was already planning to eventually revolt against his master, and was looking for Postumus' support when it came time to make his bid. If there was a deal, it wasn't a very good one for Aureolus. When, in 267, he finally did make his bid for the throne, his calls to Postumus went unanswered. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Gallienus probably would have kept right on going despite these missed opportunities, had he not been shot with an arrow and forced to withdraw to seek medical attention. This brought on what Gallienus thought would be only a temporary halt to his campaign, but in fact, it would bring an end to his attempts to reconquer the West. As I just mentioned, some scholars think there were two invasions, the first ending with Aureolus' failure to capture Postumus, and the second ending with Gallienus' injury. But most seem to think that it was all wrapped up in a single short war. The campaign was not a total failure, though. When Gallienus temporarily ceased hostilities, he had won back firm control of the Gallic territory abutting the Alps, meaning that the emperor controlled both ends of the key mountain pass. Just as Gallienus would never recapture the West, Postumus would never again have access to the Alps. This is the map that both men would bequeath to their successors, and eventually be the map from which Aurelian launched his own successful campaign to reunify the empire in 274. While Gallienus had lost control of the east and the west, he was still in control of the middle of the empire, and was not so consumed with foreign wars and internal squabbles that he failed to make his mark on the development of Rome. Well, actually, maybe it was because of all the foreign wars and internal squabbles that Gallienus wound up leaving his mark on Rome. The ancient sources uniformly dismiss Gallienus' reign as the absolute low point of the empire's history. He is often portrayed as indifferent to the fact that 2/3 of the empire had slipped away from him, and that he was far more interested in pursuing the perks and pleasures that came with being emperor than he was with fighting for what was Rome's. Highlighting the general content with Gallienus' rule is the myth of the so-called 30 tyrants. That is, the long list of men who rose up in revolt against Gallienus during his reign. Odenathus and Postumus and Macrianus and Regalianus are all on the list, as is the